Why don't we take a look at some of these stories in a bit more detail? Alex Petropoulos, I'm so sorry for butchering your surname, Alex, is a political commentator who joins me on the line now. Alex, good morning.
Good morning, and no worries with the name,
Good news, it seems, with the NHS for the workers, not junior doctors. Let's be really clear about that. Their unions are saying, right, we've gotten around the table. It looks like we've secured the best deal we can.
Yeah. So they've sort of come together and said, this is going to be the final offer, and this is the offer that we think that you'll be happy with. It's a 5% pay rise for, like you said, not juniors doctors, but nurses, ambulance drivers, frontline staff, and then also a one-off pay rise. And, this is good. It'll hopefully go to ending the strikes. But at the end of the day, I think that this also has to come alongside, systemic reform. Everyone is talking about the fact that the NHS is broken finally, but we haven't quite seen anything from the government yet about, how do you sort of tackle some of the long-term systemic issues? Now we're at the point where we're funding the NHS at one of the highest rates within Europe, and yet our outcomes are down there at the bottom. So whilst this is good, we should be looking for more from the government on that behalf and sort of saying, where is this long-term systemic reform and review?
Well, that'll be some of the questions that the unions will be asking. For now, at least, it looks like, definitely both sides have compromised. As we've said, not all the unions unite, don't seem happy, and they'll say, this isn't exactly what we asked for, but I think it was inevitable they weren't going to get that. Let's look at what the Times and also the Telegraph have been reporting on. This idea that the Times is saying that Labour's pledge to reverse the lifetime allowance on pension savings could then actually have the reverse effect, because what they're saying is many doctors and professionals might retire early in a sort of gold rush before the next election.
Yeah, so this is something that's always incredibly frustrating about British politics, which is this focus on optics and focus on the short term. And, I'm going to sound a bit critical of Labour here, but this is all within the context of, I think, broadly a much better policy programme that they've announced than the current Conservative government. But they've chosen to focus on what is, at the end of the day, 2% of the budget that was most recently announced. And in doing so, they're sort of losing sight of the bigger picture. And they're losing sight of the fact that, they could choose to sort of haggle over this small amount and haggle over, what might look unfair. But like you say, at the end of the day, this actually goes towards shoring up the NHS and supporting senior doctors. So you can't have your cake and eat it at that point.
Do you think it was right for Labour to announce a sort of counter strategy sort of less than 24 hours than we've heard from the first one, when, the aim, presumably, from both Labour and the Conservatives is to encourage more people to stay in work for longer?
Yeah, I think that you can definitely go to criticise. I think you could also say that the Conservative government, if they're looking to make this a long-standing, long-term change, which it needs to be to work, they probably should have reached out to Labour in advance and said, what, we want to do this policy. We'd love if you could actually get on page with us in supporting this policy. And I think also Labour missed out on an opportunity there to sort of go and say, what, we are a government that will prioritise the long term. And so whilst we're not going to call you out on this, we are going to call you out on what's actually missing from the budget, which is any sort of reform on things that are currently crippling the country, especially long term, like housing, and like the overburdensome tax regime.
Yeah, the question is, and they'll say, well, where do you get the money from? To do all of that and encouraging people to stay and work for longer might help. There is a really bizarre story inside the Telegraph. This idea about let's just sort of transport ourselves to Madrid for a moment and say it's lunchtime and we're having tapas and maybe calamari. There had been a plan to have an octopus farm, but there is real clamour and discontent about it, saying this would be actually a living hell for the creatures involved. It's a really sort of surprising insight into the lives of these creatures. What have we learnt?
Yeah, so it's always important when discussing these sort of animal rights issues is to sort of find some context, because, depending on where we draw the line, anything could be considered living hell. for octopuses. But if we look into the details of what's been announced for this, you're sort of taking these animals, which are really solitary creatures, and you're forcing them into crammed conditions with other octopuses, which is sort of predicted to lead to territorialism, aggression, and sort of cannibalism even. And then at the same time, you're taking what is essentially some of the smartest creatures that we know, and you're confining them to some of the least humane conditions and least humane death conditions at the point where you're sort of freezing them down to the temperature of -3 degrees Celsius to sort of kill them, which have been shown in a lot of times to be quite stressful for animals. So, like, at the end of the day, we have in what is okay animal welfare wise, sort of where are we okay drawing that line, but this seems to sort of obviously be above and far beyond that line.
And lots of people are sort of really angry about this and are campaigning against it. But you're right, there's always these different sensitivities with these stories. To go to something completely ridiculous, just to finish, Alex, is Love Island. The final, I think, was this week. I haven't watched it, but I live with people who do. There's going to be a middle-aged Love Island. ITV are looking for contestants, particularly with baggage, to come and join this programme. Is it a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great idea. I do admit I did chuckle when I read this headline. But you never know who these sort of shows might end up attracting. My friends recently became obsessed with this American TV show called MILF Manor, where you sort of take these young, hot guys and you pair them up with these middle-aged women. Bizarre, and yet they just became obsessed with it, and it was just this really fad effect. And so the most interesting question for me is, who's the audience going to be for this? Obviously, people like to project themselves into these shows, but I think that this could actually have quite a broad scoping audience.
I don't know what that says about you, Alex, and your friends, but thank you very much. Alex Petropoulos, political commentator with Young Voices UK. Appreciate your time.